Okay, head. This could also be a stroke. Where did this line? Head trauma, stroke, lead, anything along those lines. Anything that can add pressure onto the brain is what we're talking about here. So lung function, fine, right? That's not our problem. Yeah, I mean, if you have a patient who's been in a trauma, they could potentially have lung problems that would be specific to them. But just talking in general, I'm talking about past history, they're not going to have it, likely not going to have anything. So the lungs are not going to be our primary problem unless they've got pneumos and stuff, but we're focusing on how do we ventilate a patient who's going to have excess pressure on the brain and high ICPs. So ACVC, not PC. You're not going to start in PC for this patient. You don't.
It's trauma.
People think that we need to control the pressure. The bigger priority for this patient is going to be to control the CO2. So we're starting in ACVC. If after you put this patient on the vent, they start to have pressure problems because they're going into ARDS or things like that, which we'll talk about next term, you can switch them to pressure control later, but start them in ACVC. So standard tidal volumes, 5 to 8 mLs per kilogram. Here's where we're different. Respiratory rate, 18 to 22, something in the high range. We're gonna, no, we intentionally hyperventilate this patient because we want their CO2s to be low. Down here, we're gonna put maintain CO2 between 25 and 30. Generally for about the first 24 hours. FiO2 is always 100% for a trauma patient and just 5 of PEEP. We're not going to get crazy on PEEP because we don't want it to affect our ICPs. Why do we hyperventilate this patient? Why do we need a low CO2?
Keep down the pressure in the brain.
How is it keeping down the pressure in the brain?
I know this. I do know this. With maintaining the CO2 down.
What happens when we have a low CO2? What does it do to...
Your brain probably freaks out or something.
Your brain freaks out.
Yeah.
The brain's already freaking out.
It's not coming. I apologize.
Remember the
Because there's less pressure, so there's less pressure on the heart.
No.
With bypass.
All right, what's the reason?
Increases the
Thank you.
Oh, she's got the book open.
I don't remember what the answer is. But I'm smart. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So it says the cranial wall contains the brain, blood, and cerebral spinal fluid. Assessment of the cerebral blood flow is important because the brain relies on a steady blood flow to provide oxygen. So maintaining a sufficient cerebral blood flow requires an adequate CPP, which is the cerebral perfusion pressure. And so you're having a steady blood flow and you're getting it, and it's with the fluid, so you're not getting the fluid buildup.
So, kind of, but the reason that the low CO2 helps is because it causes vasoconstriction. And I'm going to talk about, there's a little controversy behind this. Well, why didn't you say it?
Well, I wasn't 100% sure.
So what? Now we're here to learn, you guys. You don't have to be 100%. Yeah, Jeremy's. He started it. I didn't do that. He started it. So we intentionally hyperventilate our patient. Don't confuse this with hypercapnia because that's a whole different thing. This is hypo. So we're going to intentionally hyperventilate our patient. It's going to drop the CO2 down. When we drop the CO2 down, it causes vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction will decrease the blood flow to the brain. That helps reduce the ICPs.
Say it slow.
It will what?
It's on tape. No, so
I
wait,
missed
let's
it too.
just one more time.
Vasoconstriction.
We're gonna do intentional hyperventilation. It's gonna bring the CO2 down. Your target is between 25 and 30. When we bring our CO2 down and hyperventilate our patient, that causes, so low CO2 in the body causes vasoconstriction. Just like high CO2 causes vasodilation. So low CO2 in the body causes vasoconstriction. The vasoconstriction will decrease blood flow to the brain and therefore decrease ICPs. But what's the other problem with decreasing blood flow to the brain? We also, so the other argument,
That's why it's 100%.
well, yeah, that's one reason why we're at 100%. But the other side of that argument is don't intentionally hyperventilate because you're going to decrease oxygen to the brain.
What is a test?
So we're going to talk about the test in the real world, Jeremy. There's two important things to discuss there. So clinically, you may or may not see this depending on the facility that you're at and the doctors. Typically, there's a fight between the neuro guy and the trauma guy because they don't get along. One wants to do one thing and one wants to do the other. The neuro's going to want to hyperventilate. The trauma guy is going to want to have the high FiO2s. So let them worry about their fight. The best time to do this is within the first 24 hours because number one, what's going to happen after 24 to 48 hours in the body anyways?
Compensate.
If you're chronically hypocapnic, your body's going to try to compensate, right? It's not going to let you stay with that high pH. It's going to compensate for it. So after 48 hours, it's not going to work anyways because your body's going to compensate for it. But here's the other thing. When my patient first comes in and has this severe brain bleed, severe stroke, severe trauma, and all this pressure on the brain, it's very, very, very dangerous. And the risk of infarct and brainstem injury, which means death, is very high at that point. So if we can do something with our ventilator to help keep down the ICPs along with the other things that we're doing as a temporary measure, that patient's going to go into surgery, they're going to do things to relieve the pressure, but that's all going to take time. And isn't the worst inflammation within the first 24 hours anyways? Think about you hurt yourself, you go to bed, you wake up and you're like, oh my God, what happened? I didn't think it was that bad. So this is just one more way we can help keep ICPs down is to hyperventilate the patient. Jeremy.
So after the 24 hours, are you just going normal because the bypass kicking in? Or?
After 24 hours, you're going to bring down your rates to normal rates and not and maintain normal ABGs again.
Okay.
So when you take your test, I can promise you that you're going to hyperventilate your patient and you're going to maintain those low CO2s. Clinically, you're going to do what you're doing at the hospitals. It's not going to hurt your patient to do this for 24 hours. What are the other things that we're going to do to try to help maintain, to help bring down ICPs? Excuse me.
Mannitol.
Mannitol. You guys know about
Where's it?
mannitol? Did I tell you that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, no, we knew this.
No, you didn't.
That's from Fireflies. Yeah, Fireflies.
Yeah. Mannitol. What else can we do to help keep our patient calm?
Sedation.
Sedate and paralyze. No, you're not. The other things that are important for this patient is infrequent suction. Anything you can do to not stimulate the patient. So we only suction absolutely if needed. So suction is only PRN, and it's even less reserved. It's less reserved than normal. Quiet room, dim the lights, like everything to try to keep your patient from being stimulated.